The early hours of June 6, 1944. 7th Army headquarters at Le Mans, well behind the Norman coast. A chateau that the Wehrmacht had occupied as its operational command post, where, for 4 years, the staff of General Oberst Friedrich Dollmann had managed the routine business of garrison duty in occupied France. On this morning, the routine had ended. The duty officers in the operations room had been receiving fragmentary reports through the night. Paratroopers landing in unexpected places. Gliders along the Orne. Naval gunfire intensifying along the coast from the Cotentin Peninsula to the mouth of the Orne. The telephone rang at the operations desk. General Oberst Hans von Salmuth's chief of staff, calling from Tourcoing in northern France, asking whether the enemy had landed anywhere yet. The reply, recorded in Salmuth's diary the same morning, described what Dollmann's officers were watching unfold. Fleets of troop transports and warships, big and small, lying at various points offshore. Masses of landing craft. The numbers were beyond what German doctrine had imagined possible. General Oberst Friedrich Dollmann, 62 years old, professional artilleryman of nearly 4.5 decades of service, was hearing the fleet numbers at first light. Dollmann had commanded the 7th Army since October 1939. 4 years and 8 months in this command. Longer than any other army-level commander on the Western Front. His army had fought through France in 1940. It had occupied the Norman and Breton coasts ever since. 6 infantry divisions, mostly second-rate troops, equipped with weapons captured from defeated armies, defending hundreds of miles of coastline against the most powerful invasion force ever assembled. Dollmann knew the math was bad, but he had also concluded, 2 days earlier, that the math did not matter. The weather had turned. The channel was rough. The June moon was wrong. The Allies, his staff had agreed, would not come this week. He had lowered the alert level on June 4th. He had ordered his corps and division commanders to a war game at Rennes for June 5th and 6th. The topic of the war game, in one of the documented ironies of the war, was an Allied airborne landing, followed by an amphibious assault on Normandy. What Dollmann did not yet understand, as the fleet numbers came in by telephone that morning, was that he had personally created the conditions that would destroy his army. His commanders were scattered. His alert was lowered. His coastal divisions were responding to a real invasion, while the war game about the imaginary one was still in session. The man who would, in 23 days, take poison in his quarters at Le Mans rather than face the court-martial Hitler had ordered was already, in the early hours of June 6th, a casualty of his own calculations. This is the story of a German army commander who heard the fleet numbers at first light on June 6, 1944, and was dead by the end of the month. It is the story of decisions made before the invasion that ensured the invasion would succeed, and of an American operational tempo so relentless that within 3 weeks it broke the man tasked with stopping it. The 7th Army that Dollmann commanded in the spring of 1944 was not the army he had led into France 4 years earlier. The formation that had crossed the German border in May of 1940 had been a fighting army, mobile and aggressive, part of the largest armoured offensive the world had yet seen. By the spring of 44, after 4 years of static occupation, it had become a garrison force performing a defensive task it was not equipped to perform. 6 infantry divisions deployed across the entire Norman and Breton coast. Aging Germans called up from reserve. Ethnic minorities pressed into service. Cossacks, Volga Tatars, Georgians. Soldiers who had been Soviet citizens until the Wehrmacht took them prisoner and offered them service in exchange for rations and the fiction that they were fighting communism rather than fighting for it. They were equipped with French rifles, Polish artillery pieces, ammunition manufactured in Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, and the captured factories of half a continent. The best German formations had been allocated elsewhere, to the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht was bleeding to death at a rate that no production schedule could replace. To the Pas-de-Calais, where Hitler's intuition placed the coming invasion, and where Salmuth's 15th Army held 17 divisions in readiness for a landing that would never come. Dollmann understood his weakness. He had asked for more divisions, more armour, more aircraft. He had received almost nothing. His superiors disagreed about how the coast should be defended, and the disagreement reached the level of strategic doctrine. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B and Dollmann's immediate superior, wanted reserves forward, armor on the beaches, the invasion to be destroyed in the surf during the first hours before the Allied build-up could begin. Rommel had concluded, from his desert experience and from his observation of Allied air supremacy in 1943, that any reserves held back from the coast would never reach the coast. Allied fighter bombers would catch them on the roads and destroy them in the open. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding OB West, disagreed. He wanted reserves held back as a mobile counterattack force, struck wherever the invasion landed, in concentrated mass rather than dispersed forward. The disagreement reached Hitler, who resolved it by giving neither commander what he needed. Some armor was placed forward, some held back. The most powerful armored reserves were retained at OKW disposal, so that Hitler personally could decide when to commit them. The result, in Dollmann's sector, was a defensive posture, neither flexible enough to counterattack effectively, nor strong enough to hold the beaches. Then came the weather. The first week of June 1944 was forecast to bring channel storms, high winds, rough seas. German meteorologists, working with substantially less information than their Allied counterparts because Allied long-range patrols had pushed German weather stations off the North Atlantic, predicted that no invasion would be possible until the middle of the month. Dollmann reviewed the assessment on June 4th. He lowered the alert level. The 7th Army's coastal divisions stood down from the highest readiness. The decision was rational by the information available to him. Allied senior commanders had spent the preceding days agonizing over the same weather. General Eisenhower had postponed the invasion by 24 hours on the night of June 4th. The Allied Weather Service, with its longer-range observations, had spotted a brief break in the storm front opening on the morning of June 6th. Dollmann's meteorologists had not. By the time the Allied fleet sailed, the German alert was lowered. The lowered alert was compounded by what came next. Dollmann had ordered a Kriegsspiel for his corps and division commanders, scheduled for the 5th and 6th of June at Rennes, well behind the coast. A map exercise, designed to think through the operational problem the 7th Army would face if an Allied invasion landed in Normandy. The topic of the exercise, by Wehrmacht record, concerned an Allied airborne landing followed by an amphibious assault. Commanders were summoned to Rennes. They began travelling on the evening of the 5th. Some were already in their hotel rooms when the first reports of paratroopers came in after midnight on the 6th. The exercise that was supposed to prepare the 7th Army for the invasion would, by virtue of its timing, be the operation that displaced its commanders from their units at the precise hour the invasion began. Across the Channel, the Allies had assembled an army that exceeded anything in human history. More than 2 million men in southern England by early June, 7,000 naval vessels gathered at ports from Plymouth to Newhaven, 13,000 aircraft. The logistical preparations alone represented a feat of industrial coordination that German intelligence consistently underestimated. Mulberry harbours fabricated in sections in British shipyards, ready to be towed across the Channel and assembled into artificial ports on the Norman coast. Pipelines coiled on channel-bottom positions, ready to be unrolled to deliver fuel to the beachhead at rates that no captured port could match in the early weeks. 3 months of ammunition pre-positioned in fields the Allies had not yet seen. The Allied deception apparatus, Operation Bodyguard, had spent 2 years convincing German command that this real fleet was a feint and a phantom fleet at the Pas de Calais was the threat. Hitler believed it. Rundstedt believed it. Salmuth believed it. Dollmann had been told that even if the Normandy coast saw a landing, the main blow would still fall at Calais, and that he was not to commit reserves until the strategic picture clarified. General-Lieutenant Max Joseph Pemsel, Dollmann's chief of staff at Le Mans, had grown uneasy through the night of June 5th. By post-war testimony, Pemsel had been suspicious that something was happening for several hours before the picture became clear. He issued an alert to 7th Army units sometime after midnight, before all the dimensions of the invasion were visible, but the alert did not bring Dollmann's commanders back from Rennes in time. It did not raise the readiness level Dollmann had himself lowered. Pemsel, the man at the headquarters when the calls came in, was working with a force that had already been disassembled by its own commander. The war game at Rennes had begun on the evening of June 5th in earnest, with maps spread across tables and corps and division commanders gathered to think through, in the abstract, exactly the problem that was about to arrive in concrete form. The exercise scenario had been devised by 7th Army staff weeks earlier, an Allied airborne landing in Normandy, an amphibious assault following. The objective of the Kriegsspiel was to refine the 7th Army's operational response to such a contingency, to walk through the chains of command, to test communications, to identify weaknesses before they became disasters in actual operations. By the standards of professional staff work, the exercise was a reasonable use of the senior commander's time. By the standards of what was about to happen, its timing represented one of the worst coordinated pieces of strategic preparation in the war. Commanders had travelled to Rennes through the day on the 5th. Some arrived in the afternoon, some that evening, some were still en route when darkness fell. Hotel rooms had been requisitioned for them. Dinner had been arranged. The exercise itself, scheduled to run on the 6th, would be a long day's work, with detailed map studies and oral examination of contingencies running into the late hours. The expectation was that the commanders would return to their units on the 7th. Sometime after midnight, the first reports of Allied paratroopers began to filter into 7th Army headquarters at Le Mans. Pemsel, the Chief of Staff, was on duty. The reports were fragmentary at first. Sounds of aircraft engines that did not match expected patrols. Drops sighted near Sainte-Mère-Église, paratroopers reported in the marshes south of the Cotentin. Other reports of paratroopers near Caen, then west of the Orne. The pattern, building through the early hours, was inconsistent with anything Pemsel had been trained to expect from a feint or a raid. A feint was a small action in a single area. This was airborne formations across a 50-mile arc. By approximately 0200 hours, Pemsel had concluded that something larger than a raid was beginning. He issued an alert to the 7th Army's units. He attempted to reach commanders at Rennes by telephone. The telephone calls began the slow process of reversing the Kriegsspiel. Officers were woken in their hotel rooms. Cars were called to be readied. The blackout conditions in occupied France meant that vehicle travel at night was extraordinarily slow, with headlights masked to slits and roads patrolled by checkpoints. A division commander at Rennes, summoned at 0230 hours, would not reach his headquarters at the front for hours. In some cases, by the time the commander arrived, the invasion had already passed his coastline, and the situation he was meant to command had moved beyond his sector entirely. By post-war testimony, Pemsel later considered the timing of the Rennes exercise one of the most painful memories of his career. The decision had been Dollmann's. The lowered alert level had been Dollmann's. The wargame topic, in its catastrophic specificity, had been Dollmann's. Pemsel, at the Chief of Staff's desk in Le Mans, had to manage the consequences of decisions he had not made, working with formations whose senior commanders were 3 to 6 hours away by road, in the very hours when those commanders were most needed at their posts. By approximately 0300 hours on the morning of June 6th, the picture had clarified into something that Pemsel could no longer describe as a feint. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had landed across the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. Paratroopers were dropping along the causeways behind Utah Beach. Sainte-Mère-Église had been the site of dozens of drops, with American paratroopers landing in the village square and dying in the church courtyard, while the village itself was on fire from a building that had been struck by an incendiary earlier in the night. Eastward, the British 6th Airborne Division had landed across the Orne, seizing the bridges over the Caen Canal that the Allies would need to keep their eastern flank intact. The landings were fragmented, scattered, in many cases miles from their intended drop zones. They were also continuous, building, and across a frontage that no feint would have justified. Pemsel had been on the telephone for 2 hours by this point. He had reached commanders at Rennes. He had alerted units along the coast. He had attempted to reach OB West and Army Group B headquarters with the picture as he understood it. The responses he received were uncertain. Rundstedt's headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye was wary of committing reserves on the basis of fragmentary reports. Rommel was at home in Herlingen, near Ulm, having returned to Germany on June 4th to celebrate his wife Lucy's 50th birthday on June 6th. Rommel did not yet know that the invasion had begun. He would not know until mid-morning, and would not return to his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon until that evening. Dollmann himself, at Le Mans, was reviewing the situation maps that Pemsel had prepared. The reports were still incomplete. The dimensions of the airborne assault were becoming clear, but the question of what was happening at sea remained uncertain. Coastal observers had not yet reported the fleet. The fleet was in the channel, approaching, but had not yet been visible from the Norman coast. The first hours of the invasion, the hours when reserves might have been ordered forward to meet the airborne forces before they could consolidate, passed without decisive orders from 7th Army. Pemsel was issuing alerts. Dollmann was waiting for the picture to clarify. The picture was clarifying through the loss of opportunity. The fleet became visible to German coastal observers in the window between approximately 0500 and 0600 hours on the morning of June 6th. As the pre-dawn light began to lift the haze over the channel, the first sightings came from multiple strongpoints across the entire invasion frontage. Major Werner Pluskat, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, was credited in post-war accounts with being among the first German officers to see the Armada approaching Omaha Beach, although later research has questioned whether Pluskat himself was at his observation post in Strongpoint 59 that morning. The broader and more reliable picture is that German coastal observers across the Norman coast, from the Cotentin to the mouth of the Orne, reported the fleet within the same window. Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen at the Crisbeck battery used his rangefinder to count the ships visible from his position and reported, by post-war testimony, that the count exceeded any number he had been trained to imagine engaging. The reports flowed up the chain to Le Mans. Salmuth's chief of staff at Tourcoing telephoned 7th Army headquarters in the early hours, asking whether the enemy had landed anywhere yet. The reply, as Salmuth recorded in his diary, described what Dollmann's officers were watching. Fleets of troop transports and warships, big and small, lying at various points offshore, with masses of landing craft. The exchange was the documented confirmation, in the words of 7th Army headquarters, that the picture had clarified. The largest invasion fleet in human history was approaching Dollmann's sector. What approached the beaches in the next 2 hours had been engineered to a scale that German coastal defences were not designed to absorb. The naval gunfire began before the landings, with American battleships including USS Texas, USS Arkansas, and USS Nevada engaging coastal batteries from ranges that German guns could not effectively answer. Rocket ships closed to within a few thousand yards of the beaches and saturated the assault zones with concentrated barrages. Heavy bombers ran final missions on coastal positions, although the Omaha beach bombing missed most of its targets due to weather and timing. The combined effect on coastal infantry, whose alert level had been lowered 2 days earlier, and whose senior commanders were still en route from Rennes, was overwhelming. The 7th Army's coastal divisions began taking the brunt of the landings at approximately 0630 hours. The 716th Infantry Division, holding the British and Canadian beaches, was a static formation of older Germans and conscripted ethnic minorities, rated as one of the weakest divisions in the Norman defence. It would be effectively destroyed within the day. The 352nd Infantry Division, the strongest of Dollmann's coastal formations, held a sector that included Omaha Beach. It would contest the American landing at Omaha with a ferocity that came close to driving the assault back into the sea, but would be unable to prevent eventual breakthrough. The 709 Infantry Division, holding Utah, would be overrun by the combined airborne assault behind the beach and the amphibious landing at the front. The defensive plan that Dollmann had prepared depended on coastal divisions holding long enough for armoured reserves to arrive. The coastal divisions were holding, in some cases beyond what their composition would have suggested possible. The armoured reserves were not arriving. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armoured formation immediately available to 7th Army for counterattack on D-Day, had been positioned south of Caen. Its commander received conflicting orders through the morning, with the chain of command above him uncertain whether to commit the division against the airborne forces, against the British beaches, or against a possible main blow that might still come at Calais. By the time the division was committed, in fragments through the afternoon, Allied air supremacy had stripped it of the ability to move in concentrated mass. Tanks moving in daylight on Norman roads were caught by Allied fighter bombers and destroyed in the open. The division reached the coast in places by evening, but as scattered elements rather than as a coherent counterattack force, it did not drive any beachhead back to the sea. By nightfall on June 6th, Allied troops had landed at all 5 beaches. More than 150,000 men were ashore. The beachhead was not yet linked across the entire invasion frontage, but every beach had held. Casualties had been heaviest at Omaha, where the 352nd Infantry Division had inflicted disproportionate losses on the American 1st and 29th Divisions, but even at Omaha the Americans were ashore and pushing inland by evening. Dollmann's communications with OB West and OKW through the day had grown increasingly urgent. He had requested release of the OKW reserves, the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr, to be moved against the beachhead. The release had been delayed. By the time the reserves were released, the daylight of June 7th would expose them to the same Allied air supremacy that had broken the 21st Panzer Division on the 6th. Documented German staff observations from the evening of June 6th recorded that the senior officers at 7th Army headquarters had recognized, before the day was over, that the situation was already critical. The week that followed, June 6th, was a sequence of failures that compounded into strategic catastrophe. The Allied beachheads consolidated. By June 8th, the British and Canadian beaches were linked. By June 12th, the entire Allied lodgement was joined into a single front. American forces under Lieutenant General Omar Bradley turned westward and began driving across the Cotentin Peninsula, aiming for Cherbourg. Their objective was the deep water port that the Allies needed to maintain the build-up at scales that the Mulberry harbours alone could not sustain. The Mulberries themselves were under construction in the days after the landing, with sections towed across the channel and assembled at Arremanches and Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. The Saint-Laurent harbour, on the American sector, would be destroyed by the Channel storm of June 19th and 20th. The Arremanches harbour would survive and serve until late autumn. Hitler's response to the deteriorating situation was to issue no retreat orders. Cherbourg was to be held to the last man. The Cotentin Peninsula was to be defended yard by yard. The reality on the ground was that Bradley's American divisions were pushing across the peninsula at a pace the 7th Army's remaining forces could not match. Dollmann faced a strategic dilemma that no doctrine could resolve. Holding Cherbourg under Hitler's order meant accepting the encirclement and destruction of the forces defending it. Withdrawing those forces meant violating the order and accepting the loss of the port. Dollmann chose to withdraw. On June 18th and 19th, he ordered units to pull back from the southern Cotentin to consolidate the defence of Cherbourg itself, accepting the loss of the peninsular interior to preserve the port garrison. The decision was tactically sound. It was also, in Hitler's eyes, evidence of failure. By June 22nd, Allied forces had reached the outer defences of Cherbourg. The garrison commander, General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, conducted a desperate defence for 4 days. On June 26th, Schlieben surrendered. The port itself had been systematically destroyed by the Germans before the surrender. The cranes had been blown into the harbour basins, the breakwaters had been mined, the dock equipment had been wrecked. Cherbourg, when the Americans entered it, was useless as a port. It would take months of repair work before the harbour could begin to receive significant traffic. For Hitler, the loss of Cherbourg was not a tactical setback to be absorbed, but a personal failure of the commanders responsible. He summoned Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Generaloberst Friedrich Dollmann to Berchtesgaden on June 28th. The summons itself, in the middle of an active battle, was a sign of how seriously Hitler regarded the matter. Rundstedt and Dollmann were to leave their headquarters and travel to Bavaria to account for themselves. The atmosphere at the Berghof on June 28th, by post-war testimony from staff officers present, was openly hostile. Hitler demanded a court-martial for Dollmann. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel was directed to prepare the proceedings. Dollmann had ordered the withdrawal that, in Hitler's reading, had ensured the loss of the port. Rundstedt defended Dollmann. The arguments he offered, by documented record, centred on the operational reality of the situation Dollmann had faced. The forces available to defend Cherbourg had been inadequate from the beginning. The strategic decision to wait the Pas de Calais rather than Normandy had not been Dollmann's. The withdrawal Dollmann had ordered had preserved a garrison that would otherwise have been encircled and destroyed, achieving nothing strategically. Rundstedt, in defending Dollmann, was implicitly defending himself, since OB West had approved the operational decisions in question. Hitler rejected the defence. Rommel, summoned separately, also defended Dollmann. The defence from Rommel was particularly notable, because Rommel and Dollmann had not always agreed on operational matters, and Rommel had no personal reason to protect his subordinate at the cost of his own standing with Hitler. Rommel's defense was professional. Hitler rejected it. The meeting ended without a final disposition. Hitler waited until Rundstedt and Rommel had left to relieve Dollmann of command, replacing him with SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Hauser was a Waffen-SS general with combat experience on the Eastern Front. The choice signaled that Hitler was no longer willing to leave the 7th Army in the hands of regular Wehrmacht officers. The order relieving Dollmann was issued. Dollmann himself had not yet been informed when he travelled back from Berchtesgaden to his headquarters at Le Mans on June 28th. By the time Dollmann reached Le Mans on the late afternoon of June 28th, the strategic situation had worsened in his absence. The British had launched Operation Epsom on June 26th, an attempt to envelop Caen from the west by driving across the Odon River. The operation had not achieved its full objective, but it had created a salient deep into the German defensive position west of Caen. The 7th Army's defensive line was bending. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, under Hauser, was moving up from southern France to counterattack against the Odon salient. Hauser's corps was Dollmann's most powerful immediate reserve. The decisions about how and when to commit it would shape the next phase of the battle. Dollmann's command decisions in the final 2 days of his life were, by documented record, increasingly erratic. On June 26th, before the Berchtesgaden trip, he had twice ordered Hauser to alter his march route to assist with the defence of Caen, and twice cancelled the order. On June 27th, he had ordered Hauser to continue toward the original objective. On the morning of June 28th, before travelling to Berchtesgaden, he had countermanded that order and directed Hauser to launch an immediate counterattack against the Odon salient with his entire corps. The directive arrived as the situation around Chaux was deteriorating beyond what the corps could realistically address. The counterattack would need to be launched without proper preparation, without adequate reconnaissance, without the air cover that Allied fighter supremacy made impossible to provide. Hauser, receiving the order, began organising what he could. The pattern of orders across 2 days, by post-war assessment from staff officers, indicated a commander who was no longer making coherent decisions. In the late evening of June 28th, after returning from Berchtesgaden, Dollmann retired to his quarters at Le Mans. He did not yet know that he had been relieved of command. He did know that Hitler had ordered his court-martial. He knew, by Pemsel's later testimony, what a court-martial under Hitler's direct interest would mean. The German higher commanders carried poison for moments such as this. They had been issued the capsules. They knew the procedure. By Pemsel's testimony, Dollmann farewelled his staff at the Le Mans headquarters in the early hours of June 29th. The exact time has been disputed by sources. Pemsel later stated that Dollmann took the poison at approximately 10 in the morning of June 29th, although other accounts suggest earlier. Pemsel also testified that he delayed approximately 2 hours before reporting the death to higher headquarters, and that he reported it as heart failure rather than suicide. The official cause of death entered into the Wehrmacht records was heart failure brought on by the stress of the campaign. The actual cause, known to Pemsel and to the inner staff at Le Mans, was the poison capsule. Hauser arrived at Le Mans to assume command. The counterattack that Dollmann had ordered, intended to go in immediately, was delayed by the change in command and by the operational realities Hauser inherited. When the counterattack finally went in late on June 29th, it went in at half the planned strength. Allied air and artillery bombardments stripped it of effectiveness within hours. The operation failed. The Odon salient remained. The British did not achieve all their objectives, but they had drawn German armour into a fight that could not be won, and they had broken what remained of the 7th Army's offensive capacity. Dollmann was buried in France on July 2nd, 1944. Field Marshals Rundstedt, Rommel, and Hugo Spurler attended the burial. He received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves posthumously, the recognition issued by Hitler personally, with a laudatory obituary that made no reference to the court-martial that had been ordered 3 days earlier. He was interred at the Champigny-Saint-André German War Cemetery in Normandy. The 7th Army that he had commanded for 4 years and 8 months would itself be destroyed in the Falaise pocket in August, completing the operational arc that his lowered alert and his Rennes Kriegsspiel had inaugurated. Pemsel, the chief of staff who had managed the headquarters through the campaign and who had filed the false cause of death, would survive the war and serve in the post-war Bundeswehr. His 1973 written testimony on Dollmann's final hours remains the central documented source for what happened in the quarters at Le Mans on the morning of June 29th. The numbers from the 7 weeks between Dollmann hearing the fleet at first light and the destruction of his army at Falaise tell the story in their own terms. By the end of June 6th, approximately 156,000 Allied troops were ashore in Normandy. By the end of June 1944, that figure had grown to approximately 850,000, supported by 148,000 vehicles and over 500,000 tons of supplies. The build-up was occurring across an open beachhead, supplied through mulberry harbours that had not existed 5 weeks earlier, and through landing craft running directly onto the sand. The 7th Army that Dollmann had commanded was not absorbing these numbers, it was being submerged by them. The coastal divisions that had taken the brunt of the landings were, by the end of June, no longer combat-effective formations. The 716th Infantry Division, holding the British and Canadian beaches on June 6th, had ceased to function as a coherent division within hours of the landings. The 352nd Infantry Division, the strongest of the coastal divisions and the one that had inflicted the heaviest casualties on the Americans at Omaha, had been reduced to fragments by mid-June. The 709 Infantry Division, holding Utah and the Cotentin, had been overrun in the drive toward Cherbourg. By the time of Dollmann's death on June 29th, the formations that had been his front line on June 5th no longer existed in any operational sense. They had been replaced by reinforcement divisions arriving from elsewhere in France, but the reinforcements were arriving piecemeal, under continuous air attack, and were being committed to a battle that was already moving against them. The weeks after Dollmann's death extended the destruction. Hauser, his successor, fought through July under conditions that no commander could have improved. Operation Cobra in late July broke the German front west of Saint-Lô. American armour poured through the gap and turned eastward toward Falaise. The 7th Army, what remained of it, was caught in the closing pocket, along with elements of the 5th Panzer Army. By the time the pocket was sealed in late August, an estimated 50,000 German soldiers had been captured inside it, and another 10,000 killed. Hauser himself was wounded during the breakout, struck by shell fragments that nearly killed him. The 7th Army that had occupied Normandy for 4 years was, by the end of August, destroyed as a formation. It would be reconstituted later in the war from other units, but the army that Dollmann had commanded ceased to exist. The post-war assessments from German staff officers placed Dollmann's specific decisions within a larger framework of failure. Pemsel's 1973 written testimony was the central source for the events at Le Mans. He recorded the lowered alert level on June 4th, the war game at Rennes, the difficulty of bringing commanders back from the exercise once the invasion began, and the final hours in Dollmann's quarters. Pemsel did not portray Dollmann as a uniquely incompetent commander. He portrayed him as a man broken by a situation that no commander in his position could have controlled, but whose specific decisions in the days before the invasion had compounded structural weaknesses into operational catastrophe. The judgment was harsh but measured. The lowered alert had been a reasonable response to the weather forecast Dollmann had been given. The Rennes Kriegsspiel had been a reasonable use of senior officers' time. The combination, on the wrong day, had been disastrous. General Günther Blumentritt, Rundstedt's chief of staff at OB West and one of the most articulate post-war German commentators on the Norman campaign, assessed the larger picture in his published writings. The 7th Army's defensive failure was not Dollmann's failure alone. The strategic decision to wait the Pas de Calais had not been Dollmann's. The Allied deception that had reinforced that decision had not been Dollmann's responsibility to penetrate. The inadequate forces, the divided command structure, the absence of air cover, the production and manpower constraints that had reduced the Wehrmacht's reserves by 1944, all of these were beyond what any single army commander could have addressed. But the lowered alert and the Rennes war game were Dollmann's. They were the proximate cause of the 7th Army's incoherent response in the first hours, and they had occurred in a context where coherence in the first hours was the only chance of disrupting the landing. The American achievement, measured against this assessment, was not a single weapon or formation. It was the operational tempo and combined arms coordination that destroyed Dollmann within 23 days of the invasion he had been preparing to repel for 4 years. The destruction was systemic. American naval gunfire from battleships and cruisers operating off the Norman coast suppressed German coastal artillery at ranges that German guns could not effectively answer. American air supremacy over the battlefield denied the Wehrmacht the ability to move armoured reserves in daylight, breaking the operational doctrine on which German defensive plans depended. American logistics delivered hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies across an open beachhead at rates the Wehrmacht had calculated were impossible. American replacement systems returned wounded soldiers and damaged equipment to combat faster than German formations could destroy them. American operational command, from Eisenhower at Supreme Headquarters down through Bradley at First Army and through Corps and Division commanders, coordinated these elements into a single integrated machine. The 7th Army, defending a coast it had occupied for 4 years, was facing an industrial military system it had no means to stop. The contrast between the two armies in those weeks was the contrast between two ways of making war. The Wehrmacht in Normandy was fighting the war it had learned to fight in 1939 and 40, defensive lines, infantry on the coast, armoured reserves to counterattack at the decisive moment, all coordinated through a chain of command that depended on senior commanders being present at their posts and on communications being maintained between formations. The American army that landed across from it, 2,500 dead at Omaha Beach in a single morning, and continue building its strength faster than the enemy could replace its losses. The 7th Army facing it had been built for a different kind of war. Within 23 days, that mismatch had broken its commander. Within 7 weeks, it had broken the army itself. The man who heard the fleet numbers at first light on June 6th had been hearing the announcement of his own destruction. He had not yet recognized it as such. By the early hours of June 29th, in his quarters at Le Mans, with the poison capsule in his hand, he had. Return now to the early hours of June 6th, 1944, the headquarters at Le Mans. The situation maps spread across the operations room, the telephones ringing through the night with reports that built toward a picture no German staff officer at that headquarters had wanted to see. General Friedrich Dollmann, 62 years old, 4 years and 8 months in command of the 7th Army, hearing the fleet numbers at first light, fleets of troop transports and warships, masses of landing craft, the beach designations that meant nothing to him yet, because the Allies had not yet taught him what they meant. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. The names that would, within hours, replace 4 years of preparation with 23 days of defeat. The man at the situation map that morning did not yet know what he was looking at. He thought he was looking at the largest amphibious operation in human history, which he was. He did not yet know that he was also looking at the end of his career, the destruction of his army, and the announcement of his own death by a hand that he had not yet recognized as his own. The decision to lower the alert had been made on the 4th. The decision to send his commanders to Rennes had been made earlier still. The poison capsule had been issued to him with his rank and would be carried in his quarters until the morning of June 29th. All the elements of what was about to happen were already in place by the time the fleet became visible to coastal observers in the pre-dawn light. The man at the map was reading reports of an invasion. He was also, although he did not know it, reading his own obituary. Pemsel's 1973 written testimony, the central source for what happened at Le Mans in the final hours, recorded the farewell to the staff and the retirement to the quarters. Pemsel did not record what Dollmann said as he left the operations room. He recorded that the farewell was made and that the door to the quarters closed behind a man who would not come out of those quarters alive. The Wehrmacht record of the death, filed by Pemsel 2 hours after the fact, listed the cause as heart failure. The actual cause, known to the inner staff at Le Mans and recorded in Pemsel's testimony 3 decades later, was the poison that German higher commanders carried for moments when their position became untenable. Dollmann's position had become untenable on the morning of June 6th. He had not understood it as such until June 28th at Berchtesgaden, when Hitler ordered the court-martial that he would not face. The American achievement that destroyed him is most often measured in the casualties of those who took the ground. 2,500 dead at Omaha Beach in a single morning, Approximately 20,000 Allied dead by the end of the Norman campaign in August. The numbers are real, and they were paid by men whose names are on stones at Colleville-sur-Mer, had absorbed the lessons of 2 years of Mediterranean fighting and had built a system that did not depend on any single point of coordination. Combined arms operated at every level. Air support was on call from the company commander upward. Naval gunfire was integrated into the ground scheme. Logistics flowed continuously rather than in pulses. The system continued to function when individual commanders were lost. The system continued to advance when individual formations were checked. The system did not break. The man tasked with stopping it did. The strategic significance of the destruction of the Seventh Army went beyond the destruction itself. The Wehrmacht, in 1944, was a force in irreversible decline. The Eastern Front was consuming divisions at a rate that the German manpower system could not replace. The Italian front was draining armor and infantry that the Western Front needed. The strategic bombing campaign was destroying production capacity that no longer matched the rate of consumption. Within this larger picture, the Seventh Army was one of the formations that the Wehrmacht could least afford to lose. Its destruction in the 7 weeks after D-Day removed from the German order of battle 6 divisions of veteran defenders, the cadre of reinforcement formations that had been built up to support them, and the operational headquarters that had managed defensive operations across the Norman and Breton coasts. The German manpower and equipment poured into the Norman fighting through July and into August, attempting to seal the breakthrough and contain the Allied advance, was committed to a battle that was being lost faster than it could be reinforced. By the time the Falaise pocket closed, the Wehrmacht in the west had lost approximately 400,000 men, between killed, wounded, and captured. The Seventh Army's share of those losses was substantial. Dollmann's death was symbolic rather than decisive. His army would have been destroyed regardless of who commanded it, against the operational tempo the Allies had achieved. But the symbolism was specific. The longest-serving army commander on the Western Front, the man who had led the Seventh Army from the invasion of France in 1940 through 4 years of occupation duty, was dead by his own hand within 23 days of the invasion he had been preparing to repel. The man who had spent 4 years building bunkers, laying minefields, training conscripts, and arguing for more resources, had not lasted a month against the operation those preparations were meant to defeat. His chief of staff filed the false cause of death and continued to manage the headquarters through the deteriorating situation, eventually serving the army that replaced the one that had been destroyed. The German cemetery at Champigny-Saint-André received Dollmann's grave on July 2, 1944. By that date, the Allied beachhead was consolidated, the build-up was approaching 1 million men, and the operational defeat of the Wehrmacht in Normandy was already certain, even though the breakthrough at Saint-Lô was still 3 weeks away. The cost of freedom on the Norman beaches and in the Bocage was measured most directly in the casualties of the American and British and Canadian and Polish soldiers who took the ground. It was also measured, indirectly, in what it took to break an enemy army that had spent 4 years preparing to hold that ground. The Allied operation that landed at first light on June 6, 1944, there was an industrial military system that could absorb the loss of 2 and at the cemeteries that hold the British and Canadian dead. The achievement is also measured, less often, in what those casualties bought. They bought the destruction of the Seventh Army within 7 weeks of the landing. They bought the death of its commander within 23 days. They bought the operational defeat of the Wehrmacht in the west, and through that defeat, they bought the liberation of France and the road to the Reich. The cost was paid in the lives of the men on the beaches. The product was the destruction of the system that had occupied Europe for 4 years. The Seventh Army on the morning of June 6th was a defensive force prepared for a war that would never be fought on its terms. The army that landed across from it was an industrial military system designed to make Dollmann's preparations irrelevant. He heard the fleet numbers at first light and was dead within 3 weeks. The fleet at first light was the answer to 4 years of his calculations. The poison capsule was his answer to the answer. These stories cost something to live through. Be part of that. I'll see you next time.